January 17, 1945, the Ardennes forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence, thick blanketing silence, the kind that muffled footsteps, swallowed voices, and made the world feel impossibly small. In a frozen farmhouse 3 miles behind the American lines, a 22-year-old radio operator from Kansas sat hunched over a steel table, his breath visible in the cold air, his fingers raw and stiff as they moved across the dials of a modified SCR-299 transmitter. His name was Robert Eugene Harlan. Back home they called him Gene. Here, in the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, they called him the voice that wouldn't shut up. Outside the forest was a graveyard of machines. Burned-out Shermans leaned like broken monuments in the snow. Frozen bodies lay where they had fallen, their rifles still clutched in mittened hands. The Germans had pushed hard in December, punching through American lines with a ferocity that stunned even the most battle-hardened veterans. Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies had caught everyone by surprise. But now, in mid-January, the tide was turning, slowly, bloodily, and in that farmhouse, with its shattered windows and bullet-scarred walls, Gene Harlan was about to wage a different kind of war. He turned the frequency dial. The static crackled. Then, faint beneath the hiss, he heard it. German voices, clipped, efficient, coordinating artillery strikes. He smiled. That farm boy's smile his mother would have recognized, and reached for the microphone. The war in Europe had become a contest of radios as much as rifles. By 1945, both sides understood that control of the electromagnetic spectrum meant control of the battlefield. The Germans had developed sophisticated radio networks, encrypted communications, and disciplined signal protocols. Their Enigma machines had been cracked, yes, but tactical field communication still flowed freely across hundreds of miles of front line. Panzer commanders spoke to infantry units. Artillery observers called in strikes. Supply convoys confirmed routes. All of it hummed through the air, invisible, essential, and, until recently, largely unopposed. The American military had not initially prioritized electronic warfare. The doctrine was simple: superior numbers, superior production, superior firepower. But as the war dragged on, as German forces grew more desperate and more cunning, a new truth emerged. You could have all the tanks and planes in the world, but if the enemy could coordinate faster, move smarter, and strike where you weren't looking, metal alone wouldn't save you. You needed to disrupt them, confuse them, make them deaf and blind. That's where soldiers like Gene Harlan came in. He had grown up on a wheat farm outside Salina, Kansas, where the horizon stretched forever, and the only sounds were wind through the fields and the crackling voice of a radio in the kitchen. His father had bought a Philco in 1936, and Gene became obsessed. He'd spend hours twisting the dial, searching for distant stations, Chicago, Denver, once, on a clear night, New York. He taught himself Morse code from a Boy Scout manual, built crystal radios from spare parts. By the time he was 17, he had his amateur license and a homemade transmitter in the barn. Neighbors joked that Gene could probably talk to the moon if he tried. When the draft notice came in 1943, Gene didn't hesitate. He enlisted in the Signal Corps, figuring his skills might actually be useful. The Army agreed. They sent him to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey for advanced radio training. Their instructors recognized something beyond technical competence. Gene had an ear. He could hear patterns in static, identify transmitters by their characteristic hum, mimic accents and signal rhythms with eerie accuracy, one officer wrote in his evaluation. This soldier possesses an intuitive understanding of radio propagation and an unusual capacity for signal deception. By December 1944, Gene was in Belgium, attached to a special signals intelligence unit tasked with monitoring and disrupting German communications. The work was unglamorous. Long hours in freezing bunkers, endless repetition, listening, recording, analyzing. But when the Germans launched their surprise offensive on December 16th, everything changed. Suddenly the airwaves were alive with panic and opportunity, and Gene Harlan saw his chance. The German soldiers advancing through the Ardennes expected many things. They expected cold. They expected resistance. They expected casualties. What they did not expect was chaos within their own communications network. For years, German military doctrine had relied on discipline and clarity. Orders were precise. Responses were immediate. The radio was a tool of efficiency, a lifeline in the confusion of battle. But now, As panzer units pushed deeper into Allied territory, strange things began to happen. Artillery coordinates were questioned. Supply convoys were redirected to wrong locations. Orders were contradicted minutes after being issued. At first, German officers assumed technical malfunctions. Radio equipment was notoriously fragile in winter conditions. Batteries died, antennas froze, but the problems persisted, worsened, and slowly a terrible suspicion took root. Someone was listening. Someone was interfering. Someone was inside their network. Gene Harlan worked 18-hour shifts. He memorized German call signs, voice patterns, and operational codes. He learned to mimic the flat, unemotional tone of Wehrmacht radio operators. His German wasn't perfect, his Kansas accent bled through, but in the crackle of static and the urgency of combat, it was close enough. He would wait until a legitimate transmission ended, then jump onto the frequency seconds later, issuing contradictory orders or demanding clarifications that tied up the network. He'd send false coordinates for Allied positions, leading German artillery to waste shells on empty fields. He'd confirm supply routes that led straight into American ambushes. One night, he intercepted a panzer commander requesting fuel. Gene waited exactly 90 seconds, then transmitted on the same frequency, imitating the regimental supply officer, redirecting the convoy 15 kilometers north to a village that had been retaken by American forces that morning. The panzers waited for fuel that never came. By the time they realized the deception, they were out of gas and under fire. But the most effective weapon Gene deployed wasn't deception. It was noise. The SCR-299 was designed for long-range communication, capable of transmitting voice and Morse across hundreds of miles under ideal conditions. Gene, with his farmer's ingenuity and his radio hobbyist's experimentation, figured out how to weaponize it. He overloaded the transmitter, boosted the power beyond safe limits, and created a wall of static that drowned out German frequencies across entire sectors. It was crude. It was dangerous. The equipment overheated constantly, threatening to explode. But it worked. German radio operators would key their microphones and hear nothing but roaring white noise. They'd switch frequencies. The noise followed. They'd try again. More noise. Panic spread. Commanders couldn't coordinate. Artillery couldn't adjust fire. Infantry couldn't call for support. In the critical hours when decisions meant survival, the Germans were deaf. An after-action report from the 6th SS Panzer Army, captured weeks later, included this entry dated January 18, 1945. Radio communications severely compromised. Unknown interference across multiple frequencies. Units operating in isolation. Suspect enemy electronic countermeasures. They were right. The enemy was a farm boy from Kansas with a microphone and an instinct for chaos. What the Germans couldn't comprehend was the sheer audacity of it. In their military tradition, radio operators were technicians, not combatants. They followed protocols. They maintained discipline. The idea that a single soldier could wage guerrilla warfare across the electromagnetic spectrum was alien to them. But Americans, raised on improvisation and individualism, saw opportunity where doctrine saw boundaries. Gene Harlan wasn't following a manual. He was writing his own. Still, the work took its toll. Gene's hands shook from fatigue. His hearing began to fade from constant exposure to high-volume static. He slept 3 hours a night, curled up beside the transmitter, waking at any change in the radio's hum. Other soldiers in the unit watched him with a mix of admiration and concern. One, a sergeant from Ohio, later recalled, "Gene looked half dead most of the time. But when he put those headphones on, he came alive. It was like the radio was part of him." By late January, the German offensive had collapsed. The Allies regained lost ground. The Bulge became a graveyard for Hitler's last reserves. Historians would point to many factors: American reinforcements, air superiority once the weather cleared, German fuel shortages, Soviet pressure in the east. But buried in the official records, in after-action reports and signal intelligence summaries, was another story. The story of paralyzed communications, confused commanders, disrupted coordination. The story of a war fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with frequencies and static. Gene Harlan's commanders noticed. In February, he was promoted to sergeant and transferred to a newly formed electronic warfare unit. His techniques were studied, refined, and disseminated. By April, dozens of American radio operators were employing similar tactics across the Western Front. The Germans adapted, switching to more secure frequencies, tightening protocols, but the damage was done. The invisible advantage they had enjoyed for so long was gone. Yet Gene himself never spoke of his work with pride. In letters home, he wrote about the cold, the food, the friends he'd made. He mentioned radio work only once in a letter to his father dated March 3, 1945. The equipment here is better than what we had in the barn, but the principle's the same. Find the signal. Understand the signal. Use it or disrupt it. You taught me that. Fixing tractors and radios when they broke. Turns out it applies to war, too. There was something deeply American about what Gene Harlan did. Not just the technical skill, though that mattered. Not just the bravery, though that was real. It was the mindset, the willingness to see a tool and ask, what else can this do? The refusal to accept that just because something had always been done one way, it had to stay that way. The Germans built radios to communicate. Gene Harlan saw a radio and thought, what if I turned it into a weapon? Throughout the war, German and Japanese soldiers encountered countless examples of American abundance. The food, famously. K-Rations and Spam and chocolate bars that seemed infinite. The vehicles. Jeeps and trucks that appeared everywhere, always. The planes that darkened the sky. But perhaps the most disorienting abundance was information. Americans didn't just have more radios. They had more frequencies, more operators, more flexibility. Where Axis forces saw structure and scarcity, Americans saw possibilities and surplus. A German POW captured near Bastogne in January 1945 told his interrogators, "You Americans fight like you have no rules. Like everything is permitted. It is unsettling." The interrogator noted, subject appeared particularly troubled by unpredictability of American tactics. That unpredictability was a feature, not a bug. It was the product of a society that rewarded innovation, that trained soldiers to think independently, that gave a farm kid from Kansas the tools and the freedom to jam enemy transmissions across 200 miles of front line. The radio became Gene's symbol, not the gun, not the flag. The radio. That box of wires and tubes and electromagnetic possibility. It represented connection, across distances, across cultures, across the static of war. But it also represented disruption, the ability to reach into the enemy's certainty and introduce doubt, to turn their strength, their discipline, their coordination into a vulnerability. After the war, Gene returned to Kansas. He finished college on the GI Bill, studying electrical engineering. He worked for Boeing for 30 years, designing communication systems for aircraft. He married, raised 3 children, attended church every Sunday. To his neighbors, he was just Gene, quiet and unassuming. Few knew what he had done in Belgium in January 1945. In 1989, a military historian researching electronic warfare in World War II contacted him. Gene agreed to an interview but declined to be recorded. The historian's notes, archived at the National Lobby Museum, include this passage. Harlan remained reluctant to discuss specifics. When pressed on the impact of his work, he said, "I just made noise. Other guys took the bullets. That's who the heroes are." When asked if he believed his jamming efforts saved lives, he paused for a long time, then said, "I hope so. That was the idea. Make them confused enough that they couldn't kill as many of us." He died in 2003 at age 80. His obituary in the Salina Journal mentioned his military service in one sentence. Robert Eugene Harlan served in the U.S. Army Signal Corps during World War II in the European theater. But the story didn't end there. In 2011, declassified Signal Corps documents revealed the full scope of early electronic warfare operations in the Bulge. Gene's unit was credited with disrupting German communications across 6 sectors simultaneously, affecting an estimated 15,000 enemy troops. A Pentagon analysis concluded, radio jamming and signal deception, operations conducted in January 1945, represented a significant tactical innovation that contributed measurably to Allied success in containing and repelling the German offensive. Gene never knew that assessment. He never sought recognition, but his work rippled forward through time. Modern electronic warfare, jamming enemy radar, hacking communications networks, controlling the electromagnetic spectrum, all of it traces back to pioneers like him. Soldiers who understood that in modern war, silence can be as deadly as a bullet, and noise can be as powerful as an artillery barrage. There is a particular kind of genius in seeing the invisible and making it consequential. The Germans saw radio as infrastructure. Gene Harlan saw it as a battlefield. The Germans heard static as failure. Gene heard it as a weapon. That shift in perspective, that willingness to fight a war in a dimension most soldiers never considered, changed the calculus of combat. It's easy to romanticize the lone operator in the frozen farmhouse, single-handedly turning the tide. The truth is more complex. Gene was part of a system, supported by intelligence analysts who decrypted codes and officers who understood the strategic value of electronic warfare. He didn't win the war alone, but he proved that one soldier, with the right skills and the right tools, could impact thousands. That the boundary between combatant and technician was more fluid than anyone had imagined. That you didn't need to fire a shot to hurt the enemy. In the end, what Gene Harlan represented was possibility. The possibility that a kid from a Kansas wheat farm could master a technology and turn it against the most disciplined military machine in the world. The possibility that innovation mattered as much as firepower. The possibility that freedom wasn't just a concept to defend, but a practical advantage, a system that encouraged creativity, rewarded initiative, and gave ordinary people extraordinary tools. The radio crackled in that farmhouse because Gene made it crackle. The Germans stumbled in confusion because one American soldier refused to follow the script. And across 200 miles of frozen front line in the chaos of the Bulge, the invisible war was won by a voice that wouldn't shut up. When the snow melted that spring, the farmhouse was abandoned. The bullet holes remained, the shattered windows, the scorch marks on the floor where the transmitter had overheated. But the radio was gone, packed up and shipped to another front, another battle. The frequency was silent. Yet in that silence there was a kind of victory. The enemy had been heard, understood, and answered. Not with more violence, but with something subtler and stranger. With noise. With deception. With the audacity to turn a tool of communication into an instrument of war. Decades later, in archives and declassified files, in the memories of old soldiers and the notes of historians, the story survived. Not the full story, Gene made sure of that, but enough. Enough to remember that wars are fought on many fronts, some invisible. That technology is only as powerful as the minds that wield it. That a farm boy with a gift for radio could reach across the frozen dark and touch the enemy's certainty, and make it waver. And perhaps that's the deeper truth Gene Harlan understood, even if he never said it aloud. That freedom's advantage isn't just material. It's not just the factories and the tanks and the endless supply. It's the space to improvise, the permission to fail and try again, the trust that even the lowest-ranking soldier might see something the generals missed. That you don't win wars by doing what's expected. You win by doing what's possible. In January 1945, in a frozen farmhouse in Belgium, possibility sounded like static. It sounded like chaos. It sounded like a Kansas accent breaking through the German frequencies saying, "You're not alone in the dark. We're here. We're listening. And we're louder than you thought." The snow fell in silence. But underneath, the air was alive with noise. And that noise, weaponized and relentless, carried a message the Germans couldn't ignore. The war had changed. The battlefield had expanded. And somewhere in the static, a farm boy was smiling, his fingers on the dial, making sure they heard nothing but thunder.